The US Federal Reserve has been the focus for markets this week, not necessarily for their action, but for their leadership. This week, currency markets were actually fairly stable, with the US dollar largely moving sideways as the market focused on the next Fed chair, as well as the Fed meeting in November. Aussie and Kiwi were actually the strongest performing G10 currencies this week, both up about 0.5%, whilst the British pound was the weakest. Earlier in the week, the US Federal Reserve announced rates would be unchanged, as was largely expected by the market. We now focus on their December meeting, where markets are pricing a very high chance of a rate hike in December. But the market was really focused on the leadership of the Federal Reserve. And overnight, we saw US President Trump announce Jerome Powell as his nomination for the next Fed chair. Largely seen as a continuity candidate by markets, his appointment should not cause undue volatility. In other central bank news, yesterday we saw Bank of England deliver their first hike in over a decade. However, the British pound fell heavily on this announcement, as markets interpreted this as a one-off move, as the bank remains very cautious given the uncertainties surrounding Brexit. Closer to home, we saw the Australian trade surplus announced for September. This was a surprise to markets, stronger than expected at $1.75 billion, with exports up 2.9%, contributing to the result. So we saw stronger volumes in metals and iron ores contributing to this result. In fact, it marks the 11th consecutive trade surplus for Australia. And given that, we expect net exports to make a positive contribution to Australia's third quarter GDP. Next week, we see the central banks in both Australia and New Zealand meeting. Tuesday is expected to be a big day for Australia. Of course, we have the Melbourne Cup, but before that, we have RBA, where they're expected to be on hold, with the recent inflation data and the lack of price pressures expected to keep them on the sidelines. RBNZ also expected on hold later in the week. If the US dollar continues to find support with improving data as we look through coming months and the tax plan remaining supportive, we expect the Aussie dollar to maintain a 76 to 77.50 range next week.